Hi, my name's Nick Lyons. I work for the European Commission for the Control of Foot and Mouth Disease, and I'm going to give a presentation on the introduction to the OIE approach to risk analysis. So the OIE approach to risk analysis, this provides an outline of a risk analysis framework and methodology which is recommended by the OIE. And this framework has a description of the four components of risk analysis: hazard identification, risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. And I'm going to be going through these different components in this presentation. I'm also going to describe a little on the difference between quantitative and qualitative approaches to risk analysis. The contents of this presentation are based very heavily on the FAO guidelines that I've cited here, and you can see the link also in this presentation. And I also refer you to the actual OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code, which is the underlying document on which all of this is based. So first of all, there are some broad concepts in risk analysis that are really important when doing throughout the whole process. So risk, these are just definitions from the Compact Oxford English Dictionary. Risk is a situation involving exposure to danger or the possibility that something unpleasant will happen. Now, this is actually a bit different to a hazard. So a hazard is the actual thing, the actual agent, the actual thing that can cause danger. So there are some various definitions here. So from the Society for Risk Analysis, a condition or physical situation with a potential for an undesirable consequence. From the Codex Alimentarius Commission, they define it as a biological, chemical, or physical agent in or condition of food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. But the OIE Terrestrial Code, on which we're referring to today, it's a pathogenic agent that may be associated with an imported commodity and that could potentially produce adverse consequences. So this could be a pollutant, it could be an infected animal, or it could be a pathogenic agent present in meat. But this is what the hazard is. So hazard is something potentially harmful to humans, animals, plants, or the environment. But the risk is the likelihood of occurrence and the magnitude of the consequences of that specified hazard being realized. So what the risk does is it brings together the probability of that hazard and the consequence of that hazard to give you the overall risk. So it's a combination of probability and consequence of the hazard. And when we talk about likelihood, you'll often see, like in the OIE code and elsewhere, you'll hear the term likelihood used. This is used in the same way that you might use the word chance or probability. These are all the same. So in the context of this presentation, but we'll try and stick with using the word probability. So what risk analysis is, it provides a formal methodological framework for dealing with hazards and risks, and it's used in various parts of veterinary medicine, mainly in import risk analysis, but also in various other ways. So the disease control strategies and policies, food safety, antimicrobial resistance, and environmental hazards. So, for example, the consequence of farming on the environment. So really it's used in all these different ways, not just in import risk analysis. And so that's going to be what we're discussing today, is how risk analysis is used in different ways in relation to animal health. So the OIE risk analysis framework, the initial purpose of this framework was to do with the import risk analysis aspect. So to provide an objective framework to make decisions on inter-country trade. But like I say, this approach is applicable to other areas of animal disease control. And the purpose of risk analysis is really to provide a supportive framework to decision makers on the management of reduction and monitoring of animal health disorders. So these are the steps that are described in the OIE risk analysis framework. And you have these different steps that provide an overview of the process that's undertaken to deal with matters that pose a potential danger. So you've got hazard identification, risk assessment, and risk management. But all along the way, you've got this risk communication, which is involved in every step. And I'll go into that in more detail later in the presentation. So hazard identification is the first step in the risk analysis. And of course, a hazard is a prerequisite for a risk. If there's no hazard, then there's no risk. And for these hazards, there are a variety of outcomes usually associated with that hazard. And at least one of those is unwanted or unharmful, but there's uncertainty over which outcome will occur. And so within the OIE framework, usually the hazard is a particular pathogen. So this might be HPAI H5N1, for example. It could be FMD virus, or it could be lumpy skin disease virus, or any pathogen really. But that's usually what we're referring to when it comes to a hazard in the context of the OIE risk analysis framework. So once you've identified that hazard, you then need to define a clear risk question considering that hazard, so like the unwanted outcome, the population of interest, and the time period. So this is an example of a clear risk question upon which your risk assessment might be based. So for example, what is the risk of introduction of H5N1 HPAI virus into domestic poultry in Ethiopia by migrating waterfowl over the next 12 months. So it gives you what your specific hazard is, which is the virus, and the population of interest, which is domestic poultry in Ethiopia, and the time period, which is the next 12 months. So it's a very clear question, very specific, and that's really needed when going to the next stage of your risk assessment, which is what we're going to discuss now. So the actual risk assessment stage. So what this is the systematic process of assessing the magnitude of the risk of an unwanted outcome associated with the hazard, considering the likelihood of the hazard and the impact of the hazard. So this, to try and put this into some context, when we talk about likelihood or probability and the impact of a hazard. So if you go to a street vendor and you want to eat some food, what is the human health risk associated with that? Now, obviously, there's good and bad street vendors. I'm not saying they're all the same, but you might say, well, okay, there's a reasonably high probability that there's of being exposed to some pathogen in the food. But the consequences are reasonably low. Like you might get some small gastrointestinal upset, but it's generally low consequences. So you might say that is a high probability, low consequence risk. For another example, which is very different, would be getting rabies from a dog bite. Now, even in a country where the rabies is endemic, the probability of actually getting rabies if a dog bites you might be quite low, but the consequences are extremely high, because if you get rabies, then there's a high likelihood of some of death or being extremely ill. So these are two very different scenarios that kind of reflect what we mean by probability and consequences of risks to human health. But of course, every day we make judgments based on our intuition about risk. Just walking across the streets, catching the bus, all these different things. But what the OIE risk analysis framework does is it provides a systematic way of looking at risk particularly addressing complex scenarios where it may not be so intuitive. So within this risk assessment component, in the OIE code, they talk about different aspects. So you've got your entry assessment, which describes the biological pathways through which a hazard could be introduced into a particular environment and the likelihood or probability of each pathway. Then there's the exposure assessment. So that's how the pathways through which animals in the environment would then be exposed to that hazard. And then there's the consequence assessment. So that's describing the different possible consequences of exposure to the hazard. And then all these things are brought together to give you an overall assessment of risk, and that's what your risk estimation is. So here on the screen, and there's the link at the bottom here, is an example of a risk assessment that's been published and is openly available. And this risk assessment is to do with members of the public having access to the countryside during an FMD outbreak. And this is in the UK context, so which is a free country for the mouth disease. So what this process does is all the different stages are described by which people, animals, or vehicles could be contaminated or exposed to the virus along the way going to the countryside. So starting from home, traveling, during their activity in the countryside. So that's essentially the equivalent of, it says release here, but that's essentially the equivalent of the entry assessment on this slide. So that's one aspect that needs to be considered. But then there's the aspect, well, okay, so they've taken the hazard to the countryside, but then animals then need to be in contact with that for it to actually have any consequence. If there's no probability of any contact, then there's no risk. And this is what your exposure assessment is. So this assessment here hasn't considered the consequence. This is just looking at entry assessment and exposure assessment. But and the reason for that is that, well, the consequence is, because it's FMD in a free country, the consequence is going to be is always going to be very high, because you've got another FMD outbreak occurring. So so that's why it's not really considered here. But this is quite a useful reference, and I can encourage you to read it. It has a good overview of the process. So what I want to look at now is the guide that we are kind of referring to mainly throughout this presentation. And this is this guide here, and there's a link at the end of the presentation. And this is a guide that provides a way of using the OIE risk analysis framework adapted to animal disease risk management. So thinking in particular, thinking about endemic settings and things like foot and mouth disease or avian influenza. And what this guide does is it describes 3 different steps to apply that risk analysis framework. And these steps are to do a risk pathway analysis, where you look at the different steps that are necessary to get from a hazard to the unwanted outcome. And then through doing this, you identify and collect the necessary information to estimate the likelihood of each step and the impact of the unwanted outcome. And again, this comes together to give you your overall assessment of risk. So when it comes to estimating risk, there are 2 general approaches to doing this. There's qualitative or quantitative approaches. The qualitative approach is when you use words to describe risk. That's the best way of putting it. But what you can do is you describe it with words, but then you can rank the risk. A quantitative approach is when you try and ascribe numerical values to quantify the risk. Now, both of these methods are valid in undertaking risk analysis, but they're kind of used in different ways in different circumstances. So qualitative approaches are very useful as part of an initial evaluation, particularly if data are lacking, or you need to do an assessment very quickly, because the quantitative approaches can take a lot longer and often need quite a lot of data to do. But the qualitative approach is very useful at the start, because it then kind of indicates to you if you need to go forward and do the more involved quantitative analysis. But often these approaches, of course, are combined, and this is what we would call a semi-quantitative approach. So this here just gives some examples of the different risk scales that can be used in qualitative risk assessment. So there's various different ones that are used. You might use words such as very low, low, medium, or high. Negligible is often used to describe it, and you can see here the different descriptions of this. So, for example, in this framework here, a high probability or likelihood can be described as almost certain. Another example, negligible in this framework here, the probability is sufficiently low to be ignored. So these are the ways that you're. So this is like a qualitative risk assessment. So these are the way that you can use words to describe these different risks. So this table here just kind of is more comparisons of different qualitative estimates from OIE or EFSA, for example. And I won't go through all of these. You can read the slide here. But there have been other attempts to try and relate the qualitative to some numerical definitions. So it kind of goes a little bit towards the quantitative aspect, but it still really is a qualitative approach, where certain is a probability of 1 compared to negligible, which is indistinguishable from 0. So it's just to give you an idea of how they're perhaps related. So that's a description of the risk assessment stage. So once you've done that, you then need to consider, well, if there is a risk, then you need to think, well, how do you manage that risk? And that's what you do under risk management. So you identify and implement risk reduction measures based on the outcome of the risk assessment. And you use the principles of control of infectious disease to do that. So reduce or restrict virus production or the production of a disease agent, which might be through culling or vaccination, for example. Then there's reducing contact rates within the population. And when it comes to thinking about value chain analysis, actually streamlining the value chain can actually be quite a good way of doing that. Then there might be other ways you could reduce the contact rate by perhaps having cleaning and disinfection. So you reduce the possibility of transmission. And then of course you can reduce the susceptible population, which would be kind of culling. But there's various things you can do on these different things, but these are the principles. So once you come up with these different options, you then have to appraise them, and it's essential to have consultation with your stakeholders here. Now, this whole process is iterative. So you might come up with risk management strategies, but then you monitor them and you evaluate them to see if it's actually working, and then you adapt them if they're not working. And this whole process could be alongside a cost-benefit analysis as well. But through the stakeholder consultation, you need to kind of decide, well, what is acceptable risk? And this can be very challenging, because what might be acceptable to some may not be acceptable to others. So this is an important thing to consider, and this is why stakeholder consultation is so important. Which brings me on to risk communication. So risk communication is something that is ongoing throughout the whole process, and it's critical for trust and transparency in the risk analysis approach. It needs to start early on, and relevant areas might be providing information on likelihoods of disease impact or likelihoods of risk pathways occurring, acceptability of the risk management options, and of course they have to be acceptable, or the more acceptable they are, the more likely they are that they will be actually applied. But there's also disseminating information on the risk analysis process and what the risk management measures are. And then there's this aspect of communicating uncertainty in any risk estimation. So there's always uncertainty, be it in a qualitative or quantitative approach. And it's important to communicate that, particularly to decision makers, but also to other stakeholders. So in conclusion, the OIE framework, although it was initially designed for making decisions on international trade, it's a very flexible approach that can be used for analysing other types of risks in animal health. And this guidance document here provides a detailed overview of how that can be done. And I guide you to look at these pages 15 to 22 of these guidelines to give you more details relevant to this presentation I've just given. So here are just a few acknowledgements. So the authors of that guide, Jonathan Rushton and Nick Taylor, and also Millicent McLaws, who provided input into this presentation. And this here is the reference with the risk assessment that I referred to earlier, which is well worth a look. So thank you for your attention. I hope you found this presentation of interest, and good luck with your future risk assessments and risk analyses. Thank you.